Rise and Fall, the story of Solomon. At the Ridge, we are committed to teaching through the books of the Bible. So we're currently in a series where we're teaching through the Old Testament book of 1 Kings. Today, we get to chapter 8. In 1 Kings chapter 8, it ends with these words. Chapter 8, verse 66, they blessed the king and then went home joyful and glad in heart. Chapter 8 ends well, glad in heart. They went home glad in heart. Would you like that? Would you like to leave here today glad in heart? Do you want to be filled with joy? I do. We can. So let's dig into this chapter. Verse 22 tells us this. Then Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in front of the whole assembly. So there's people, lots and lots of people, and they're gathered. So he said, well, why? Why are they gathered? What are they doing? And maybe it's a concert. Or maybe it's a political rally. Maybe it's a sporting event. If it's a sporting event, we know this. We know it's not in Cleveland, because if it was in Cleveland, it was a sporting event, it would look more like this. Empty. There were people. There were a whole lot of people. And so why? Why was this mass of people gathered? Well, we find out why. The passage right in front of this one, chapter 7, verse 51, tells us all the work King Solomon had done for the temple of the Lord was finished. We've been looking at that for a couple of weeks. Solomon, he builds his palace, he builds the temple. Well, all of that, it's now done. It's been completed. And we read it was exquisite. The temple that Solomon built, the estimated cost, if that were to be built today, estimated cost $160 trillion. Trillion. It was filled with gold and precious metals. Chapter 8 begins this way. It begins by telling us that once that temple was completed, what they did, they brought the Ark of the Covenant into the temple. And when the Ark entered the temple, something happened. This happened. Chapter 8, verse 10. When the priests withdrew from the holy place, the cloud filled the temple of the Lord. And the priests could not perform their service because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled his temple. So Solomon, he called all the people to gather at the temple. He's got, the glory of the Lord has descended upon it right there with him. What does Solomon do in that moment? You think maybe Solomon uses that moment to give a speech? No. Does Solomon in that moment deliver a sermon? No. Instead, in that moment, Solomon decides to do this. Verse 22 and 23. Then Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in front of the whole assembly of Israel, spread out his hands toward heaven, and said, Lord, the God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven above or on earth below. You who keep your covenant of love with your servants, who continue wholeheartedly in your way. What does that sound like to you? A prayer. That's a prayer. And at this moment, with all these people gathered, with the presence of the Lord descended on the temple, Solomon, he busts out with a prayer. 1 Kings chapter 8, most of this whole chapter, it's a prayer dedicated to the temple. Dedicating the temple. So we're just going to walk through this prayer of Solomon. And as we do this morning, we might learn a few things about prayer. We might learn a few things about God, and we might learn a few things about ourselves. Well, here's the first thing in this prayer of Solomon that really caught my attention. Verse 22. Then Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in front of the whole assembly of Israel, spread out his hands toward heaven. You notice what he's doing. You notice how he's praying. Because the way I read this, Solomon's not praying like this. Solomon, he's praying like this. So 1 Kings chapter 8, prayer tip number 1 is consider your posture. Did you know that in the Bible, that over 20 times, God encourages us to raise or to lift our hands in prayer or in worship? And there's a lot of different ways that this can be done, a lot of different styles and techniques. You know, there's this is one of the most common ones, just kind of, palms up, hands kind of in front of your body. This posture, I like to refer to this posture as this is like the hold the baby posture. Kind of a nice beginning spot. And maybe when people get more comfortable, you've seen people do this, and it's like, well, they lift it up, and then all of a sudden it becomes the Mufasa position, right? I mean, Lion King. Some people, you've seen this when they're worshiping or praying, they like to do something like this. You know, this is the Jesus is number one posture. Or this, the village people. Or you can close the fist and turn it into the Rocky posture. Or touchdown, block that shot. My personal favorite worship posture is this one. I like to call this one the single gal worship. It's like, look, no ring. I love Jesus and I'm available. So I don't know. I mean, what do you think about expressing our worship and our praise to God with our body? Is that something you're comfortable with? It's me, not so much. This isn't something that comes naturally for me. You know, growing up, the only time that I raised my hand was if I had to go to the bathroom. So what Solomon's doing here, maybe it's really natural for some of you. For me, it really isn't. But hear these words. Paul says this in the New Testament, 1 Timothy 2:8. He says, I want the men everywhere to pray, lifting up holy hands. That is in our Bible. Solomon did it. Paul encourages us to do that. I wonder, well, why? Why is that important? Why is using my hands important? Well, I think it has something to do with, God knew then what science is discovering today, and that's this. You and I, we are psychosomatic beings. And here's what that means. That means our body and our emotions, they are connected. The posture of our body, it influences the emotions in our body, and vice versa. The emotions in our body influence the posture of our body. What we do out here with our body, well, it can create certain feelings in our spirits. We will feel different emotions when we fold them than when we lift them. So Solomon, he begins this prayer with these words. Verse 23, he says, Lord, the God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven above or on earth below. And that's praise. And so we see right out of the gates that we can speak our praise with our words. We can also feel praise with our bodies. What we do with our body can be a catalyst for what we feel in our heart. Have you ever tried to raise or lift a hand in prayer or in worship? You ever tried that? Even a little bit? We'll do. And I also want to say this, it doesn't have to be here. It doesn't have to be when there's a lot of people. It doesn't have to be in a large group setting. It can be something, when it's just you and God. Because, the measure of worship isn't the measure of the intensity of worship. It isn't what's going on out here, right? The measure of intensity of our worship, it's what's going on here and here in our hearts and in our minds. Do we really mean what we're singing? Or are we just, working along with the lyrics? Do we really mean it? That's where the value of worship is. But when it's just you and the Lord, try it. Try it this week. Let your praise, let your worship be more than just your words. Also find a way to involve your body. And maybe it would be, just a simple palms up when you're praying, kind of submitting to God, maybe honoring to God. Just try that. Or maybe it's, a praise. God, I recognize who you are and your majesty and your greatness, and lift a hand to him. And when you do that, pay attention to how and what you feel. Well, Solomon, he continues, verse 27, says, but will God really dwell on earth? The heavens, even the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this temple I have built? Solomon, he's recognizing this God of ours, he's big. And we may be familiar with him and we have a lot of access to him, but every now and then I think it's really helpful to recognize how big he is. I mean, he exists literally without beginning. I can't even wrap my head around that. He exists literally with no end. That one makes my brain hurt. He transcends a universe that is at least 12 trillion light years across, and he spoke it into existence with a word. Isaiah tells us that God, he calls each one of the 200 billion trillion stars by name. Me? Sometimes I mix up the name of my own kids. God, he knows and looks at 200 billion trillion stars and says, oh, that one, that's Alpha Centauri. That one, that's Lula Borealis. That one, that's Regal Centaurus. Compare his capacity with mine. I mean, God, he's the one who created, he designed quantum physics. Me? I'm still trying to figure out how to change the clock in my car. Next week's going to be great. Time change. My car clock's going to be on time again. God is big. A lot of times I think what can happen is we can get a little disillusioned with God when we ask him for something, when we pray for something, and we don't get what we want. I think it's helpful to ask, is it fair to subject God to what we can understand? Because prayer is not God handing the reins of the universe over to me. He answers our prayers according to his goodness and his will and his plan, which may or may not be the same as mine. If your 5-year-old were to say, hey, I'd really like to have a gun for my birthday, would you say yes? What if they really, really wanted it? I think not. Right? God, in the same way, he loves us too much to say yes to all of our requests. If you feel like you're getting a no, understand this. It's not just you. You're not the only one. Remember, this God, he's big. He has a different perspective than we do. We don't necessarily know what's behind it. Maybe he's protecting us from some unforeseen problem. Maybe he is shaping us for some future purpose. Maybe he has a long-term plan that is bigger than my short-term problem. Don't stop trusting him. 1 Kings chapter 8, prayer tip number 2 is this: prayer isn't just asking. Prayer is trusting, especially when we don't get what we're asking for. Don't stop trusting him. Prayer is recognizing that the God who remembers the name of 1 billion trillion stars, he has not forgotten about me. He's good. He's faithful. And he's not done yet. Well, Solomon's prayer continues, verse 27 and 28. He says, the heavens, even the highest heavens, cannot contain you. How much less this temple I have built. Yet give attention to your servant's prayer and his plea for mercy. Lord my God, hear the cry and the prayer that your servant is praying in your presence this day. How does Solomon refer to himself? Did you catch that? He said, your servant, your servant, your servant. 4 times in 3 verses, Solomon refers to himself as your servant. And the timing of this, don't overlook the timing, because Solomon, he's not saying this in a moment of crisis. Rather, he is saying this in a moment of historic success. He has just completed the construction of this temple. Most leaders around the world, they would hold a look at me conference, right? They would hold a praise me party, not Solomon. Next verse 29, he prays, may your eyes be open toward this temple night and day, this place of which you have said, my name shall be there, so that you will hear the prayer of your servant that prays toward this place. You know what that is? That's humility. That is some deep humility. Have you ever noticed how we tend to attribute, bad things to God and good things to ourselves? I do this. When something bad happens to me or in my life, I've got this tendency to say, well, God, why? Why did you allow this to happen? God, why is this happening? Where are you? But when something good happens, I have this tendency to think, oh man, I crushed it. Prayer tip number 3 is this. Prayer, it shifts the focus from me to him. Notice that? We can see it clearly in 1 Kings chapter 8. It also happens in our life. When we lift our prayers to God, it's humility. Prayer shifts the focus from me to him. See, humble people don't necessarily think less of themselves. They just think of themselves less often. Humility isn't self-deprecation. Humility isn't low self-esteem. Humility, it involves a healthy self-forgetfulness. Humility is ceasing to be so preoccupied with me. And prayer, man, like nothing else, prayer is really good for that. Prayer is really good at changing our perspective. It helps us to recognize there is one who is bigger. There is one who is better. There is one who is greater. There is one who is wiser. I'm not in charge. I'm not in control. I'm not the master of this universe. He is. Well, the next thing Solomon does in this prayer, it reminds me of something that happened to me a while back. I had a challenging day, and so I was ready for a break. So I get home, I pick up a book, and I start reading the book. It was good. It was refreshing. It was starting to fill my tank until I turned the page. And when I turned the page, I discovered this. I thought, really? You're going to put the UPC code right there on the page? You know what that did? That killed my vibe. Just like that. And that's what happens next in 1 Kings chapter 8. Remember what's happening. It's an exciting time in the life of this nation. It was standing room only. This magnificent temple had just been completed. It was finished. The Ark of the Covenant was brought in. The glory of the Lord filled this place. And then Solomon, he prays and he acknowledges God's majesty. He acknowledges God's goodness. And then he prays this. Verse 31, when anyone wrongs their neighbor. And he was just getting warmed up. Verse 33, when your people Israel have been defeated by an enemy because they have sinned against you. And this, verse 35, when the heavens are shut up and there is no rain because your people have sinned against you. I read this part of the prayer and I think, Solomon, what are you doing? This is not inspiring. This is not uplifting. 22 verses. The longest section of this prayer is all dealing with sin. And when you look really close, it's not just dealing with sin in general, and it's not just dealing with sin in the past. He is actually calling them out for their sin in the future. Sin that they hadn't even committed yet. 22 verses like this one, verse 46, when they sin against you, for there is no one who does not sin. I read this and think, Solomon, you are putting a UPC label in the middle of the page. Lighten up, buddy. You know, you're killing the vibe. And that's not all. The passage ends, after it finished, he finishes praying. He did this, verse 63. Solomon offered a sacrifice of fellowship offerings to the Lord, 22,000 cattle and 120,000 sheep and goats. That is 142,000 animals slaughtered. Can you imagine how loud, how messy, how bloody that would have been? 142,000 animals would generate over 400,000 gallons of blood. 400,000 gallons of blood. Imagine the sight. Imagine the smell. Now, I might have thrown up. It's a pretty nasty thing that's going on there. We read things like this in the Old Testament. We think, well, why? Why so much blood? Why so much death? Why so much carnage? And I think it's important for us not to get snooty when we read these kind of things. Not to think, oh, well, back then they were really primitive, and now we are so much more civilized. But to remember, you know, if I want to eat meat today, I don't have to go and hunt it. If I want to eat meat today, I don't have to go out and kill it. If I want to eat meat today, I don't have to go and even cook it, because our system of food acquisition, it disconnects us from the source of the food. Every time we eat, we should recognize, I need this. Every time we eat, we should recognize, I am not autonomous. I'm not. I cannot survive on my own. I need to receive life outside of me in order for me to live. In order for me to live, something else needs to die. That's the rhythm of creation. And vegetarians, this also includes you, because that broccoli, it has been beheaded from the stalk. Right? This physical truth that's built in to the way our world is designed, that something needs to die in order for me to live, that points to a deeper spiritual truth. Genesis chapter 2, verse 15 tells us, the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. And the Lord God commanded the man, you are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat from it, you will certainly die. God, he gave humanity the whole work, saying, I made this for you. I want you to enjoy this. I want you to have fun. Just one thing. There's just one thing that's off limits. Well, what did they do? They did the one thing. And God, from the very beginning, God has been very, very clear. Genesis 2, verse 17, for when you eat from it, you will certainly die. God was very upfront. He's serious about sin. The cost, the consequence of sin, it was very clearly laid out. So back to 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 63. Solomon offered a sacrifice of fellowship offerings to the Lord, 22,000 cattle and 120,000 sheep and goats. What God is doing here, when we understand that passage from Genesis, when we understand the deeper dynamic that is work, when we understand that, then we can understand this passage isn't barbaric. It is actually quite amazing. This is showing us God really is, he's true to his word. When he said, you will certainly die, that's the consequence for sin, well, he meant it and he stuck with it. He was true to their word. There is a penalty of death for sin, and he's just. And justice is a good thing. We want justice, right? We want a world where evil, it doesn't win. Justice is part of God's goodness. And so God, he doesn't just undermine justice, but because of his love, he offers a way out of this death penalty. All the way back here in 1 Kings chapter 8, God is allowing us to have a substitute. Instead of our life for our sin, we can substitute another's life for our sin. He spells this out in Leviticus chapter 17, verse 11. It says, the life of a creature is in the blood, and I have given it to you to make atonement for yourselves on the altar. It is the blood that makes atonement for one's life. You get that? The reason for the blood is that. That's the reason for the 142,000 animals. And that is the reason for the cross. That's the reason for the cross. Goes all the way back to the book of Genesis. And I imagine Jesus, when he was here on this earth and he was in Jerusalem, and when he walked by that temple, and when he saw people bringing their goats and bringing their sheep and bringing their cattle to the temple, he knew that was going to be him. He knew he was here to fulfill that, to offer his life for our lives, to satisfy justice for our sin. Recognize Jesus, he didn't just come to teach and to perform miracles. He came, the very center of the reason of his coming was to be our substitute, to pay the death penalty for sin. Is this relevant for you? If you have sinned, then yes. Have you said, I've sinned? Have you accepted the sacrifice of Jesus for your atonement? Have you accepted the sacrifice of Jesus for your forgiveness? Have you accepted the sacrifice of Jesus for your salvation? Because you are invited to. Just tell him. You can do that. Right here, right now, just say, yes, Jesus, that's me. I've sinned. That death penalty, that applies to me. I need you. I want you. I accept what you did on that cross as my substitution. I accept that. I receive that. Thank you. I want to thank you by following you with my life. 1 Kings chapter 8. Really long prayer of Solomon. Remember how this passage ends? Verse 66. They blessed the king and then went home joyful and glad in heart. 1 Kings chapter 8, this chapter ends well, joyful, glad in heart. Do you want that? Do you want to be glad in heart? Do you want to be filled with joy? Well, today, we don't need to do what they did. Today, we don't need to sacrifice 142,000 animals because today we know about Jesus. Maybe you're here this morning and you're like, well, my life isn't going very well. I got some issues and I got some challenges and there are some things in my life that hurt deep. I hear you talking about joy, but what do I actually have to be joyful about today? I'll tell you what you have to be joyful about today. Jesus. Jesus. Jesus left the glory of heaven and he came to this broken earth. Jesus became a human for us. Jesus, he showed us how to live. Jesus, he taught us how to love. Jesus, he sacrificed his life as a substitute for our life. Jesus, the cross, and Jesus, the empty tomb. On the third day, resurrection, victory, hope, a future. Jesus was resurrected from death to defeat death and to defeat sin. If God were to not do another thing for you beyond sending Jesus to rescue you, would you have enough to be filled with joy forever? Yes. 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 See, the key to being filled with joy, even when life is hard, even when life hurts, is to recognize the source of lasting joy, is to remember and to be thankful for Jesus.